Today I wanted to walk through one of my favorite packages, config. I use this package in almost every Node.js project I create. Anytime I want to have an external configuration file or multiple configs that I can change based off of the environment, I always reach for config. So I'm going to walk through some of the different settings and how I use config in my projects. So I'm going to start out with a basic Express.js hello world example. So you can see here I have one route that just outputs hello world. I have a couple of different settings up at the top. I have port and I have host. So I'm going to go ahead and just start this right now. I will be starting this application by pressing F5. I always like to start the app in debug mode. If you're curious on how I set up this launch JSON to be able to debug Node applications, I'm going to link my other videos in the comments on how to set up debugging. Okay. Looks like I forgot to install Open. There we go. Now the hello world is starting. I'm going to close this. You can see here I have, I'm using this package open to launch my URL automatically. So as soon as I press F5, it's going to launch my browser. This is typically what I want. I have it set so that this only happens when my Node environment is set to development. I find that just to be just real helpful for debugging. So I'm going to install the config package. And with the config package, it expects to have a config directory in the root of my application. I'm going to create, it always looks first for a default file, and you can have a couple of different types of configuration files. You can have a JavaScript files. A lot of times I'll do YAML. Today I'm going to play with TOML. It's a configuration file format that's a lot more human readable than JavaScript, JSON, or YAML. So I'm going to start this off, and just right off the bat I'm going to take my host and my port and move those into the TOML file. So I'm going to create a server section. Oops. There we go. And I'm going to add just the port as 8080, host localhost. These will be my default settings. I'm going to import the package up top. And instead of hard coding these into my scripts, I'm going to do a config.get. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get first the section, and then the key. So the port is just going to be server.port, server from up here, the section heading, and then port, which is the value underneath. I'm going to do the same thing with host, and that's just server.host. So now I can pull these out. I'm going to restart the application just to make sure it works. And you can see here, this is common if you try and use a format other than JSON or JavaScript. You have to do the same thing with TOML. As it says, it's looking for a specific module called TOML, so it's not included by default. So I'm going to go ahead and install the TOML dependency and then run it again. Okay, excellent. That looks like it's working on localhost 8080. listening on localhost 8080. Excellent. The next thing I want to do is I tend to have a lot of these node environment checks spread throughout my application to see if I'm running in development mode. But instead of actually checking the environment itself, what I can do is I can set a flag. I'm just going to call it open. And I'm going to set that to true. And so instead of looking for my development environment, I'm just going to be checking this flag. So here I'm going to say config.get server.open. So if it gets the server.open and it's a truthy value, then it should open the URL. So if I run this again, I should expect to see my browser open because I have that value set to true. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to stop this and I'm just going to make sure this works. I'm going to set it to false. I'm going to hit F5 again. And it is listening and my browser did not open. So I'll set it back to true just to make sure. Excellent. I don't want this to open by default just because when I'm running in production or a different environment, I don't want a browser to spawn. I only want that to happen on my local box. So I'm going to set the default to false. And I'm going to check my dependencies. I'm going to make sure open is a dev dependency. That way, when I install this on a server, I can install just the dependencies, and the open dependency, because it's listed as a dev dependency, won't be installed. And that's the reason why I wrote the code like this. If I were to write it like this, it would actually error out in every environment. Open would have to be installed in every environment on production on my local. But if I actually write it this way, this code will never get run unless this returns a truthy value. So because of that, I can be pretty safe about running this in a dev environment. And this code will never run in production. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to set my server.open up so that I can run it just locally. So config has another option. So the settings in this local TOML file get picked up if the file is in the config directory, and it'll actually overwrite the settings of default. So I can demonstrate this by just setting open to true. Even though the default is set to false, I should have my settings, my open to true setting override that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F5 again, and it is opening. So that means local is working. And now local is intended to be for my local machine development only. It's not supposed to be deployed into the production environment. So what you have to do is always ignore the config local.toml. That'll make sure that I never commit this to the repository and I never push it out. That would definitely cause some issues if it were pushed out. Another thing that I can also do is I'm going to set the port to 0, which means that on my local, the express function app.listen, if you pass in 0 for the port, it'll just take a random port instead of always specifying it to 8080. And because I have open to true, that'll work well for me. So you can see here, it just started a server on 52,765. And that way, if I'm running multiple servers simultaneously and they're all using 8080, I won't have to worry about collisions. So if I stop this again and then run it a second time, you can see it's going to pick another port. So this time, let me see, I think it's actually reusing that port. Nope, I do get different ports. So that was the previous port. No, they're just very similar. They're all different ports. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the host. So because it's already set, because host is already set in the default, these settings are only going to override what's in the default. So putting host here or omitting it, it's just redundant. So I'm gonna remove it and just accept whatever's in the default. Okay, excellent. So now another thing that I like to do is I'm going to have some extra configuration for my app. I'm going to move in some strings into the app. So I'll say my greeting is going to be hello world. And in here, I can say config.get app.greeting. Can hit F5 again. Hello world. Excellent. And just to make sure it's working, I'll add 3 exclamation points. Okay, so now my message is being returned from the default.toml file. Let's see, I can actually move this out too. Let's just make it simple. Now if I do config.get app.start, and I'm going to replace that 0. I'm going to use this as my placeholder. I'm going to replace that with the URL. And that's this message down here. And everything gets exclamation points. Going to rerun this. And there's my message I was looking for with the exclamation points. Awesome. Okay, I actually really hate the exclamation points here. And there we go. And you can do a lot of tricks with this. You can create different settings here. This could be, let's say, English. So you could internationalize your strings all using the configs. So here I have no more magic strings in here. If you wanted to, you could even add the routes into the TOML. I'm not gonna go that far, but you kind of get an idea of what you can do. Another thing that I often do is I create a production TOML, and a lot of times this is going to be a little bit different than what the default is. Let's see, all the strings are going to be the same, but there's a couple of environments where I like to bind to every address. Sometimes running inside of a Docker container, it's nice to bind to every address and not just the local host address. So because of that in production, I tend to bind to everything. And I'll continue to use the default port 8080. Let's see, I can test this by setting my environment to run as it were production. So I'm going to stop this server. I'm going to set the environment variable node config env to production. This is what I would set on the production server so that when I run this application, it knows it's running in production. And then I'm going to start it. So you can see here, it's actually listening on this address. If I open it, this is just because the browser's stupid, but if I open it on this, on any of my bound local addresses, which 127.0.0.1 is, it's going to start listening. But I can see here that it output the correct information. It has the address zeros and the port on here, but the port actually is wrong. It should be should be using 8080. Oh, sorry, that's because of my local TOML file. So if I truly wanted to test production, I'd have to get rid of my local TOML. Going to run that again. Okay, and then I can see here it's running on 8080 and it didn't open. So that was another clue, is that it opened. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back because I'm debugging locally. I'm not going to run the production version right again. Oftentimes I like to pull values out of the environment. Another reason to do this again is running inside of a Docker container or an Nginx environment. Sometimes it's going to supply the port to you. So you may not know the port that you need to run on. Maybe it's 8080, maybe it's 8081, but the actual environment is going to set that up for me. So oftentimes there's an environment called port. So let's see, I don't have a port set, but we'll set one later. To pull values out of the environment, we're going to create a new file, and it's going to be called custom environment variables.toml. And again, these extensions can be .js, they can be YAML. The config package supports a lot of different extensions, but just for this, I'm going to go ahead with the TOML extension. So let's see, I'm going to go here, I'm just going to copy everything. And again, we're not going to take these from the environment, we're not going to take those from the environment, but we are going to take this. And instead of specifying it here, I'll config what environment variable here to set as port here, and it's just going to be called port. So I'm saying that the environment variable port will be set to the value port. And the way this works is the custom environment variable TOML is going to have highest priority over default, which is going to have the lowest priority. And let's see, we should be able to test that by saying port equals 9999 npm start. So now my application's running on port 9999. And that was because I was able to set the environment variable port to 9999 when I ran npm start. Now, an interesting thing I've noticed with the Windows subsystem for Linux is that it seems to be running on two different ports. So it actually runs on one port above that I specified, as well as the port that I specified. So I'm not sure why it's running it on both, but this is some weird issue that's only specific to the WSL in Windows 10. If I were to run this on an actual Ubuntu or Debian server, it would only be listening on this one port. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop this. If I were to run this again, you can see it's not picking up the port anymore from the environment. Because I don't have an environment variable port set, it's going ahead with the port option from my local. So the highest priority is always going to be set to your custom environment variable. The next priority is going to be set to your local, and I believe then production, then to your default. And as far as specifying the other configurations to run, I would always use node config env. You can specify development as well. And if you wanted to do that, you could create a development.toml. and have specific settings just for development. You can also go further. Depending upon how many environments you have, you could create a different config for every environment. So here I have my local development, which won't be checked into the repo. I have a production setting. I also have a QA setting and a development setting. And of course, these are all just overrides built on top of the default. And then anything can be overridden with the custom environment variables. So if you want to know more about this package, just go to npm.js, search for config, and in the repository there's some pretty good documentation on all the different options you have. Okay, well this is now pretty clean. I've taken all of the magic numbers and magic strings out of the index.js file. If you're curious how I set up other parts of this application, or how I got my ESLint and Prettier working, definitely check out my other videos. Again, I'm going to link those in the comments. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching. Bye.